Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining this workshop. I'm Dr. Zayda. I'm going to be discussing how we can evaluate inclusion in the workplace. All right. So to begin, I would like to discuss, well, the agenda, we're going to be doing introductions. I'm going to go straight into what is inclusion and then a proposed framework. And also, we'll discuss what the next steps are to promoting inclusion in the workplace, and then we'll conclude with Q&A. About me, so I am an assistant professor at Cal State Northridge in the Department of Social Work. I also have a background in nonprofit management. I worked for 10 years in nonprofits. Specifically, I spent a large deal at the Urban League of Greater Pittsburgh, where I worked in program management, development, and evaluation. I also have experience with art-based nonprofit activities. I have a PhD in urban planning and public policy and a master's in social work. And my research generally looks at inclusion and exclusion of marginalized groups. Specifically, I've been looking at the immigrant and ethnic community and recently foster children and youth and adoptees. My research also focuses on nonprofits and urban context. So that's me in a nutshell. So I'd like to go straight into the topic for today. What is inclusion? This is my favorite topic to discuss. We are going to be putting our critical hat on today to really think about what does inclusion mean from a conceptual standpoint and how does this translate to evaluating inclusion in the workplace. So one of the things I'd like to invite you all to think about is a time that you felt included at work. Just take a moment to think about that for a second. So one of the things that I recall as a new faculty at CSUN that I experienced was that on my first day of work, I had folks coming out, reaching out to me, giving me their phone numbers, inviting me to lunch. We ended up meeting up. And these are just a few examples that sort of sheds light on how I felt welcome into the CSUN community in the Department of Social Work. And there's so many different ways that we sort of welcome our newcomers and our staff to organizations. So I'd like to really invite you all to think about these different ways that inclusion manifests because it's going to look different for everyone. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. So one critical question I'd like to invite you all to think about is inclusion, is it possible to have absolute inclusion? So in other words, is it possible for an organization to be 100% inclusive, having no exclusionary elements at all? What do you think about that? Let's see. You can put, so I'm asking you all to put yes or no in the chat box. No. Okay, someone put no. Any other thoughts? Anyone thinks yes? Is it possible? Okay, so most people are saying no. So organizations in general have exclusionary elements. Okay, so all respondents say no. So it's not possible for an organization to be 100% inclusive. Here's the next critical question. If you were conducting an inclusion evaluation in your organization, who would you survey? Someone put everyone, someone put all, okay, all employees, everyone, the entire company, all stakeholders, people having connections with the organization. Okay, so this is a really important question because essentially who you survey, who's being left out, whose perspective you include is going to ultimately determine what inclusion looks like, right? So if we're surveying employees, getting their perspective, that may be a different perspective from the managerial staff, right? Or even the community members. They may have a different perspective on the degree to which the organization is inclusive. So having all of these different perspectives is going to provide different perspectives of the inclusion. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper to think about how, depending upon who you survey, is really going to help understand what the inclusion looks like in the organization. We're going to talk about the proposed conceptual framework that I'd like to invite you all to consider when we're thinking about inclusion. So part of my research has focused a great deal on measuring immigrant inclusion. So for example, I did a study that looked at how the state of Florida is inclusive towards immigrants. And it's very interesting because what I found in that study was that, inclusion, in particular in the immigrant context, is multi-level, multidimensional. It exists on a continuum. And also there, as the critical question I mentioned earlier, when we're thinking about immigrant inclusion, we should also think about exclusion. And so this framework that I'm presenting reflects much of the research that I've done, and it also reflects the literature. So let's dig a little bit deeper to sort of unpack what this really means. One definition of inclusion is that it refers to the degree to which individuals feel that they belong to a certain group. So, what that really means is that inclusion is something that you feel. It's an emotion, it's a sensation that you get inside of you that alludes to how you feel when you're navigating a particular environment. So, in this case, we are looking at inclusion in organizations, but we can also think about inclusion as something that exists beyond organizations in different settings. So, for example, you may think about how inclusive you may feel when you're moving or going or traveling from city to city, right? So, for example, I'm not from LA. I have lived in Irvine, I lived in Pittsburgh, I lived in St. Louis, and all of these cities have different feelings, right? So, when we're thinking about inclusion, we're thinking about really how we feel when we are in a new environment, whether that's a workplace, a nonprofit, a company, or a city. Another aspect to understanding inclusion or having a sense of belonging is how it is the function of the group's willingness to include the individual. So, what that means is that how we begin to feel included is not something that just occurs or emerges out of nowhere. It's something that is reflective of how the individuals in that particular setting, whether it's the workplace or wherever, what are they doing or the lack thereof to contribute to our sense of belonging, right? So, in order for me to feel included in a particular workplace, I need to evaluate about how are individuals treating me. So I brought the example up in the beginning about how when I started this position at CSUN, people walked up to me, new colleagues, saying, "Hey, do you want, let's go out for lunch. Here's my phone number." So these are all things that they are doing to create a sense of inclusion. So that really gets at how when we're evaluating inclusion, on one hand, it's about how we feel, but on the other hand, it's about what other people are doing to contribute to inclusion, which is what this slide says here. To measure inclusion, we must consider how the individuals feel and the actions of the group members that potentially contribute to the feelings of belonging. So that goes back at what you all put in the this chat box, how you need to evaluate everyone, evaluate the company, etc. So inclusion is really a two-way stream. And if you're just capturing one aspect, then you're just getting one aspect. But if capture not just how people feel, but also the actions of others, then you get a more complete picture of inclusion in the work environment. Another aspect to understanding inclusion is how it's multi-level. On one hand, inclusion is based upon our individual perceptions of inclusion, which is essentially going to vary from person to person. And sometimes our own life experience dictate whether something is inclusive or not. Even our cultural backgrounds is going to determine whether something is inclusive or not. But also inclusion is not just our individual perceptions, it's the actions that are enacted by individuals in the organization. So this includes not just, let's say, the managerial staff or colleagues walking up to me, right, asking me, "Hey, you want to go to lunch?" But it's also the policies, the procedures, the programs, and social interactions that determine the degree to which that workplace is inclusive. So one of the things I'd like to invite you all to think about is how, because you all mentioned how you want to get information from everyone, which is great because you're getting the micro level, you're getting the meso level. Also, I'd like to invite you all to think about how it's really important to know like what perspective that you're getting, right? So if you're just evaluating the policies, then you're really missing the employee perspective. Or if you're just evaluating the managerial staff, then you're missing the employee perspective. And it's important to really separate those, right? So, and from a statistical standpoint, it's important to separate it to really understand what is what. The next aspect of inclusion is understanding how inclusion is multidimensional. And that really gets at how there's different types of inclusion, right? So I may go into a workspace, and on one hand, I feel like it's inclusive in this way, but on the other hand, I feel like it's not that inclusive, which sort of reflects what you all put in the chat box, which is getting at how it's not really possible for an organization to be 100% inclusive. It's possible, more plausible that there may be high degrees of inclusion on one dimension, but on another aspect, it may not be that inclusive. And the preliminary results of a research study that I'm doing alongside what studies have already shown demonstrates that inclusion is multidimensional and there's various dimensions. Some examples are rights, cultural, social, and legal. For example, social refers to the different social interactions that we have with each other. Rights refers to the degree to which we have rights in the organization. Cultural refers to the various different diversity aspects. It's very, very complex, and the list continues to go on. So, an organization, for example, can be inclusive culturally, but not socially. So therefore, when we're evaluating inclusion in the workplace, it's important to really capture the various dimensions of inclusion to holistically understand the degree to which that workspace is inclusive, because otherwise we are sort of getting a biased examination of inclusion. If, let's say, I want to evaluate an organization and I'm only asking questions about social interactions, I'm not getting any perspective on rights. I want to now discuss how inclusion manifests. The results that I'm going to share with you all is the results of a preliminary study that I'm doing that includes data from about 75 students where I asked for them to tell stories on what inclusion means to them. And not just inclusion, but also exclusion. According to the results of this study, preliminary analysis reveals there's various indicators of inclusion. So I'm going to share what some of these indicators were that manifested in the data. The first one is accommodation. This one really gets at how when we need a particular accommodation, are we able to get that accommodation? The second one is making friends. So having friends in the workspace. And then the next one is social justice support. So that refers to colleagues standing up for you when there's conflict. Do you feel alone, or are there individuals who come to you, support you, provide you with information, validation, and resources to sort of help you to get through the conflict, specifically when you're being mistreated in the workplace? The next one is diversity, which refers to the degree to which there's diversity across identity markers. So with this one, it's various identity markers. So gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, but the list goes on, right? So when we think about identity, identity is not just the salient ones that we think about. It's various different identities that we have. Is there diversity across the organization? Another one, which is sort of like diversity, but it's a little bit different, and it deals with identity reflection. This one I defined as individuals who are in positions of power. So that would be, for example, the management, reflect the individuals that they serve or accompany. So when the person see that the manager or the supervisor or the owner of a company reflects them, then there's a higher likelihood that that person is going to feel a sense of community and a sense of belonging. Another indicator is inviting to, I call it this variable, invite to hang out, which, as I mentioned in the earlier example, when colleagues approach and they say, hey, do you want to hang out? So being able to cultivate relationships outside of work also helps one to establish a sense of belonging in the workplace. Another indicator of inclusion is social groups. So this refers to the presence of groups that reflect the identity characteristics that you highly associate with. This may or may not be applicable to all workplaces. So, for example, Cal State Northridge, for example, it's a university, there's social groups, student groups, faculty groups, etc. So this may or may not apply, but having different identity groups that reflect the identity characteristics of certain individuals based on their background can help to foster a sense of belonging. Another one, which is sort of alluding to social inclusion, is conversation inclusion. So when you're in the hallway having a conversation or in the lunch table, to what degree does the colleagues actually include you in the conversation? Do they see you? Do they hear you? Do they see that you're by yourself? And do they include you in the conversation? So those very micro level interactions also help to establish a sense of inclusion for employees. So these were just a few examples of inclusion in the workplace based on the preliminary analysis. There are a lot more, but I just wanted to give you some concrete examples of how inclusion manifests in the workplace. And you can see that with all of these examples, it's really getting at different dimensions. You know, some of them are social, some of them are cultural, some of them are rights. And it's really important when we're evaluating that, we're really separating it, right? Not just calculating or evaluating each one as we go down the list, but also seeing how we score socially. How do we score with the cultural inclusion? How do we score with the rights inclusion? And how do we score with the legal inclusion? And that helps us to have a very specific illustration of how we're doing with inclusion across the various dimensions. All provides a higher degree of validity to be able to parcel out and see how they vary across different aspects. This next aspect of inclusion is understanding how it manifests on a continuum, which you all mentioned. It's not possible to have inclusion 100%. Maybe you have 10%, 50%. So it's really on a continuum. And that's really important because when you're developing a survey and you're trying to evaluate inclusion, if we know that conceptually inclusion is something that's on a continuum, then how we ask that in a survey should reflect how we are conceptualizing it. So the question then that we develop is going to be one that manifests on lower and higher degrees. It wouldn't be a binary variable. We wouldn't ask yes or no questions. It would, from a validity standpoint, it would be more suitable to ask questions, use a Likert scale to sort of get at the granular level of how inclusion occurs. So an example would be a survey question that asks, to what degree do you feel included or welcomed at your job? So this question is a Likert scale question, and it helps to measure how an individual, how do you feel? Do you feel included? Another example would be asking the question, what proportion of individuals do you feel welcome you in the workplace? So again, this is getting at how inclusion is manifesting across the continuum. Another sample question to evaluate inclusion is, to what degree do you feel that your workplace is diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, language, etc. So this example helps to, and let me just pause and say these are just five indicators of identity that I included, but you can include any indicator of any identity. You can continue the list. This question, what it does is that it helps to reveal diversity across various aspects of diversity, because diversity does it's very multidimensional, and it's not just about race and ethnicity, right? We can dig deeper and look at diversity with language, with sexual orientation, with family configuration, and the list goes on. Another question to evaluate inclusion is, to what degree does the management represent the community that they serve or accompany? I'd like to now sort of dig into this concept of exclusion. So we talked a lot about inclusion, but exclusion is also very important, and we don't really get to talk about that much. There's so many DEI initiatives, and we talk about how to promote inclusion. And even in the scientific literature, there is a bias towards this concept as well, where there's a lot of research on inclusion, but not a lot of research on exclusion, and even proposed measurements that measure inclusion doesn't really unearth how exclusion occurs. And so, one of the elements that this conceptual framework acknowledges is that exclusion is it exists, and it's potentially if you know that there's a relationship between inclusion and exclusion, and so we need to account for that methodologically when we're evaluating. For example, how do acts of exclusion decrease inclusion? Another question is, how may inclusion and exclusion coexist? So, for example, it could be that two people were in the same room. For you, inclusion may be this, but for me, that same act may be exclusionary. And I like to give the example of eye contact, for example. For one person, eye contact may be inclusive, but for another person, it may be exclusionary and disrespectful. So, is it possible? How do we account for that methodologically? It's really important to do that, because otherwise, we face validity concerns with capturing inclusion and exclusion. Also, understanding your audience is really important, meaning like who's taking the survey. Is it possible that the inclusion scale is the same across countries and cultures? So that's one of the things that this proposed research study that we're doing is going to be looking at. It's going to look at the external validity of the scale to determine, is this a scale that's only specific to the United States nonprofit industry, or is it possible that there is cross-national variation? To recap, inclusion is multi-level, inclusion is multidimensional, inclusion exists on a continuum, and inclusion, when thinking about inclusion, it's also important to consider exclusion. So these are four elements of understanding inclusion that I'm proposing as a framework to evaluate inclusion in the workplace. So finally, I want to share some ideas on what can we do with this information. An action step I'd like to invite you all to do is to think about, what does inclusion mean for you? What does inclusion look like in your workplace? Being able to take the information that I just discussed to apply it to your workplace. Does it apply? So one of the things I'd like to invite you all to do is to critically reflect upon how inclusion manifests in your workplace. Observe the various different interactions, the policies that are in place, and think about, is this inclusive? Is this exclusionary? And imagine and become aware of your thoughts and feelings as you navigate throughout the day. That's really the first starting point, to sort of have a better understanding of inclusion is to observe it yourself. I am offering a free inclusion evaluation as a part of this inclusion project, which is a research study that seeks to develop a scale to measure inclusion. As a part of this project, organizations, nonprofits that participate will, I'll send over the survey for your organization employees to complete, and you'll receive a free evaluation that calculates the degree to which your organization is inclusive across those various dimensions that I mentioned. And then that will also include a comprehensive report that you can utilize in taking next steps to promoting inclusion in your organization. This is something that's going to be rolled out next year in the spring of 2025. Why is inclusion important? You all are here. You all are advocates of inclusion. I'm sure you know the answer to this question because inclusion helps to promote employee retention, positive mental health, and work productivity. So I invite you all to consider joining this project in order to take the next step to sort of see how your staff, your colleagues and employees, how are we doing with inclusion in the workplace? If you want to learn more about this project, I'm going to send you all this QR code that you can connect with this QR code. I think one or two question survey that asks for your name and email address, and I'll follow up with you to advise the next steps for the project. That concludes my presentation. I'd like to now invite ask away any questions. Do you recommend for employees to display inclusive behaviors? So if, for example, encourage them to invite new hires to lunch. Absolutely. So that example sort of gets at how it's all about relationship building. So having different activities that can promote people getting to know each other, establishing trust, which is the core to having a sense of belonging, because inclusion refers to how the outsiders treat the insiders, right? Or how one group of people treat another group of people. What are we doing to promote a direct line between the two individuals, newcomers, or just people in general? What are we doing to promote those lines of communication and trust to be established in order to then promote a sense of belonging? And so that is one way, various activities, but then also I'd want to talk about how you can even go a step further and examine, well, what are we doing? What are the deficits, right? So while relationship building is important, also understanding how are we, where are the holes, where are those points of exclusion can also help. So while on one hand there is this blanket thing we can do, promote inclusion, have activities, but also having, being able to understand how every organization is going to be different in terms of what they need to promote inclusion, because the points of exclusion is going to vary across organizations. So being able to have that picture of, and where the deficits are can then determine how we can take next steps in addressing those areas of deficit to be able to promote inclusive behaviors.
So I want to thank everybody who showed up today. So if you could type into the chat one word, una palabra, that represents your thoughts, feelings, or reflections at the end of today. And I like to harvest these words and create a word cloud as an example of outcome evaluation, if you will. Thank you.
Yeah, we have love, support, grateful.
So I want to just thank Dr. Sorrell Medina for sharing your insights, passion, obviously on the topic, your expertise,